Hey everyone, Cody here. We've been offline a little bit longer than expected due to some scheduling issues, so I wanted to do some quick housekeeping before we get into this week's episode. Last time we had our core episode, we mentioned that we'd be diving into our Edward Bernays series, specifically discussing Adam Curtis's documentary, The Century of Self. And that is still very much the plan. We actually did record about half those episodes, but we haven't been able to get together for the second half yet. So rather than release them separately, we're going to hold off on that for at least one more week. So if you haven't had the chance to watch the documentary yet, now's your extra time to go check out at least those first two episodes before you listen to that. So in the meantime, though, this week we have something we're really excited about, our very first interview episode. And Joe is the point man for this. So I'm going to let him handle introduction of the guests. He does a great job with that. And I will say that this one pairs really well with the meditation episodes that Joe has put out so far. So we think you're going to enjoy it. We'd love to hear feedback on how you think it went once you've been able to have a listen. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Joe for the rest of the episode. Enjoy the week. And next week, we hope to be back with our deep dive into Bernays and Adam Curtis's The Century of Self. Enjoy the show.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Well, welcome back to the Propaganda Loves You podcast, the show that asks and answers the question, when are we finally going to interview someone? Today is that day. The wait is long overdue, but we're finally going to have a special guest on today. So I'm joined by Arthur. My name is Joe, and we have a special guest today, Vince Fakhoury Horn of the Buddhist Geeks podcast and many other entrepreneurial endeavors. Vince, thanks for joining us today. I just want to throw it to you for a few minutes and give you a chance to say anything you like as a way of introduction to our audience. What do you want to say about yourself?
Yeah, thanks for having me. Great to be here with you. As you said, my name is Vince. I'm originally from North Carolina and currently live in Western North Carolina near Asheville. My wife and I left for about 10 years so we could go individuate away from our families and then move back here to start a family. So I have a 10-year-old son. I'm a parent. And as you mentioned, my professional life, I'm a Dharma teacher in the Buddhist tradition. I was authorized in a couple Asian lineages through my teachers who are boomer Buddhists. One of them quite famous, named Jack Kornfield. Some people may have heard of that name or seen a book, in their bookstore. And yeah, I've been teaching for the last 15 years, but at the same time, as you said, I've been doing a podcast and running a nonprofit called Buddhist Geeks. And our exploration there has mostly been around how the Buddhist contemplative tradition is evolving in the modern and postmodern, you could even say the meta-modern era, and how technology and culture are shaping Buddhism and what Buddhism may have to offer those things. And so that's been my sort of lifelong inquiry. And out of that, I've done a lot of projects exploring what I think of as contemplative technology projects, different kinds of applications and projects meant to use technology as a kind of contemplative aid, or you could think of it as like a technodelic to help kind of speed up and smooth out the contemplative process. Kind of like psychedelics, although psychedelics don't often smooth out things. They usually just speed them up. So yeah, that's a bit about my background. And then in terms of politics and kind of this domain, I'd say I'm a late bloomer when it comes to activism. And really in the last few years, as a Palestinian American, my mom was born in Kuwait. My mom's side's mostly Palestinian. I've sort of, for obvious reasons, been vocal and speaking up, and both within the Buddhist world and then also in kind of like social media space. But for me, it's not like so much about activism. It's just about trying to support my family and people that are suffering. So I don't, I guess, think of myself as a sort of like principled activist. It's just more like kind of based on the causes and conditions I find myself in.
Yeah, I appreciate everything you're saying there. I just wanted to pick up on a few of these threads, I guess, real quick. The tension, or perhaps it's a productive tension that you mentioned between boomer generation teachers in the meditation community and the Dharma world, and then millennial teachers, which are one of the more, you and your partner Emily are some of the prominent representatives of the millennial generation of Dharma teachers. And I'm just interested in how you relate to that tension. What does it feel like as a millennial teacher, the tension between our generation? I'm a millennial too, a bit younger than you, but we're both in the millennial group. So how do you sense that tension with the boomer generation of teachers? And yeah, how do you kind of relate to it in your own work?
When I started Buddhist Geeks in 2006 with my friend Ryan Olkey, we were both at the time students at this Buddhist school called Naropa. We jokingly call it the Buddhist Harvard because there's only 2 or 3 Buddhist universities, thus it must be top tier. And at the time, we started the Buddhist Geeks podcast in direct response to what we saw as the kind of failings of boomer Buddhist media, which at the time were mostly magazines. And we felt like there were just certain topics they weren't exploring. There was certain kind of knee-jerk relationship they had to technology at the time, which was mostly dismissive. Again, think back to this is right when Web 2 was starting to heat up and before we had really learned how badly these technologies could go. But, we did the podcast entirely because we were frustrated with boomer Buddhists and the kinds of conversations that they could have or were even willing to discuss. So we wanted to open up that conversation. So from the very beginning of my exploration of this stuff, it's been a sort of generational response to the boomer generation. And while I totally appreciate in many ways the boomer teachers and institutions, that I practice in, there's a lot of good things to say about them. Once again, when it comes to Palestine now, I'm once again breaking with this same generation of teachers. I should mention, too, many of my teachers are also Jewish ethnically. And this is such a well-known phenomena within our kind of American convert Buddhist world that they sort of affectionately call themselves Boo Jews. And so, yeah, I've gone through yet another kind of, I guess, turning around this and a generational split. And I think it's generational because I look around and I see people that are 40 or younger. And it seems like when it comes to how we're relating to things like Israel and Palestine, there's a pretty big gap there. So, yeah, once again, it's a generative tension. I think there's a lot of good stuff that comes out of it, but, there's a lot of critique as well. And then the real challenge to me is then trying to offer something that is new, that actually can carry forward the integrity of what's come before, like without throwing the Buddha out with the bathwater in our case. That's a real challenge, to be honest.
Yeah, well said. This tension between generations is something that I feel like transcends like subcultures. You see it in almost any domain. Like we've talked about a lot on the podcast,
Yes.
especially just sort of analyzing the voter information even after an election, like the 2024 presidential election, looking at the different age groups and how much separation there is, especially on topics of like strong moral significance, something like genocide in Gaza, or even the economy, like anti-capitalist opinions break down by generation in big significant ways. And so we're just kind of seeing
Yes.
a huge shift in perspective in 40 and younger, like you said. And one book that we read the end of last year on the podcast, The Dawn of Everything, it's sort of a big anthropological cultural study, but a term that we liked to play with a lot in our conversations that they used in the book was schismogenesis, this idea that groups define themselves against other groups, that like you have a dominant culture and then there's a subculture within it that resists those dominant factors and eventually splits off and defines itself against that original group. And I'm thinking in those terms, especially on the topic of propaganda, and sort of the exigency or the motivations that we feel to start new projects or to do things differently. I think you describe yourself as an entrepreneur in many ways, and you kind of see that in your work. You do a lot of different projects. When it comes to the idea of starting a new project, to feeling that urgency that something needs to be done differently, do you sort of feel it in that kind of schismogenetic way? Like you're defining yourself against something that is dominant but is no longer working?
Yeah, 100%. I think every project I've been involved in that feels like significant has been that, where it's like we're trying to do something for a different generation or different culture. So yeah, very schismogenetic. Say that word again.
I think I said genetic, but genic might be the better, because it's kind of like
Schismogenic.
a
I like
verb.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
An adjective. Yeah. I
100%.
don't know. I'm an English teacher and I can't figure out the part of speech sometimes. I have
I
to
love
figure
it.
it
It's a
out.
great term. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. We had a lot of fun with that book.
I,
Yeah.
I, I started
Yeah.
it and could not get through. So
It's
Oh,
intimidating.
props to you all for
yeah.
slogging through that one.
Yeah. We got, it's reading, like most things, maybe meditation too, is easier when you do it together.
Yeah,
And
good
so
point.
it was fun to read that book, the three of us together, and we have probably
Nice.
Arthur, 10 or 11 episodes of
Yeah.
just long discussions, chapter
Yeah.
by chapter for that book.
We broke it down slowly.
Makes sense. You'd have to, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's cool. So yeah, if you want to speak about propaganda in general, just like how you understand the concept and then like any significant experiences in your life in general or related to the Dharma that stand out for you as like moments where you had to reckon with some propaganda and choose some way to relate to it. Anything that stands out for you
Mm,
in that sense.
yeah, sure. Okay, two things come to mind here. One is sort of an early formative experience, and this was my experience of post 9/11. I was a freshman in college at the time, studying engineering at NC State University. And soon after, of course, there was this huge sort of anti-Islamic and anti-Arab kind of backlash that occurred here. And I saw it very directly in terms of the impact it had, particularly on my grandfather and grandmother, in terms of, like, to make it very practical, they were on some kind of list, the so-called million-person Arab list. And every time they traveled, they'd be pulled aside, set in a room, usually for between 3 and as much as 8 hours. They'd often miss their flights, and they'd be sort of either left alone or lightly interrogated, or some combination of the two. And then on top of that, my grandfather, who's also an entrepreneur, suddenly all of his businesses started having issues with the IRS, which seemed a little odd considering how long he'd already been in business and how nothing had really changed. So it seemed likely, though we didn't have any direct proof of this, that he was also being targeted by the federal government. So all of that to say, there was the clear kind of support for going into Iraq. There's like 90% of people were supporting the war at the time. There's a huge amount of support for it. And then culturally, the sort of deep, unexamined Islamophobia was present. I mean, obviously there were some critics of that, but they were a fringe minority. And it was very clear to me the gap between my experience of myself and my family and this sort of larger cultural trend. I could see how much propaganda was present because it sort of was in direct contradiction with my own lived experience. And so there's no way for me to not see it. The other thing I'll mention around propaganda, my understanding of it has come through a technique that one of my teachers, Buddhist teachers, Kenneth Folk, developed in 2010 called social meditation. And he basically just figured out that if you meditate out loud with other people, it's a lot easier to teach them how to meditate than if you give them instructions, have them go off, try it out, come back, report on what happened, and then you give them feedback. So he found it was just like a pedagogical breakthrough. But then it turns out that doing that with other people makes meditation a relational activity, and it allows you to meditate on relationship. And there I saw, because of some of the innovations that he made early on and that I ended up kind of developing on top of, that once you kind of break the rules of what the tradition has handed you and you start doing things differently and see that they work better, then, it's kind of open-ended, like, well, what else can we do? And one of the things that he ended up doing was taking very simple practices, like a very simple mindfulness practice that we call noting, where you're using just like a word or two to describe whatever you're experiencing moment to moment. Like if I were noting, I'd be like thinking, breathing, relaxing, letting go, tension, etc. It was just kind of tracking what's happening moment to moment. One thing Kenneth did to help people learn how to do this even easier is he added the phrase "there is" in front of the notes. And he says, okay, just say "there is" and then use a word or two. For the uninitiated, people that don't even understand Buddhist theory or mindfulness, it helps put the words that follow in the gerund form. which is usually ends with an ing. And that gerund form is important because it's like verbifying a noun. You're taking something that's like an object and you're making it a process. Instead of thought, it's thinking. Instead of walk, it's walking, etc. And what I ended up learning from this is that the way that you frame the meditation, because this is in a sense like a frame, there is blank, the experience in pretty profound ways linguistically. So it taught me a lot about the power of linguistic framing. And I've come to believe that those who control the frame name the game. They are able to basically define what is permissible and what is possible to even discuss. And that seems to be similar to how propaganda functions, where most propaganda seems to be at the level of narrative warfare, of being able to define what is even acceptable to discuss, what the Overton window is on a particular topic. So I've learned a lot about that from my own experience of relational, what I call introspection, being aware of the thoughts and experiences that are arising in the space between us. And that the way that we frame the practices and the way that we design even practice really shapes what can be experienced. And a lot of traditions are just have these super narrow frames, and then they take the experience that arises out of that, which is deep and profound, but then they say, well, this is like the whole truth, of reality, it's basically like Enlightenment propaganda. It's a sort of way of propagandizing a particular kind of realization, which is actually in reality a narrow band of what's possible in the human experience.
I just want to pick up on some of these themes because you drew this through line with framing and how the linguistic framework that we use to describe reality to ourselves and others really determines the nature of the experience in a big way. And I love how you connected to me, having some experience with like Vipassana meditation, it seems like a somewhat straightforward technique to simply say, there is breathing, there is anxiety, there is worrying, or, just describing things over and over again. But connecting it to the way that we see social relations writ large and how we relate to each other and how that connects to propaganda and stuff. And I'm just thinking like, the framework, there's a connection here with media because the moment you're pointing out after 9/11, early 2000s, it was still largely broadcast media that dominated the narrative, right? MySpace didn't come around for a few more years, and so there wasn't really social media to speak of at the time. It was still the radio, the TV, the newspapers. It was like these main broadcast kinds of media.
Right.
And now what you pointed out was like, 90% support for the war in Iraq right off the bat, right? There's a huge like surge in patriotism. And I can't help but think that has something to do with the way the media was dominated at the time. And it's only been recently, and I pointed this out recently on the podcast, that we have polling data already from public support for the war in Iran that's launching now, that's ongoing. And there's such a drastic shift in public opinion between what's happening now and what happened in the early 2000s. It's almost the reverse, not quite 90%, but at least a simple majority, if not a significant majority, disapprove of what's going on now.
Right.
I'm just thinking about how the technology creates opportunities for these narrative frames to get broken apart and to reassemble in more productive ways.
I mean, the fact that Buddhist Geeks was able to exist at all is evidence of that, because prior to podcasting, there really was no way to have a sizable audience of people to listen to unless you could raise the capital to start a magazine or a TV show or something like that.
I kind of want to reflect too on the fascism that was obvious right after 9/11. Like we can talk about different kinds of awakening, and obviously meditation and Buddhism are about awakening in a certain sense, but there's also kinds of political awakenings that we can have. And it seemed to me, what seemed shocking to me when I've arrived at some of what feels like some new level of political realization, I look back at the history and realize, oh, this is not some new phenomenon that's occurring in the world. It's something that's been going on. I just wasn't able to see it because my narrative framework wasn't calibrated in a way that would allow me to see it. And so like the genocide in Gaza was a huge political awakening for me. And like, I wasn't like a patriotic supporter of all the war efforts before that, but it really shocked me just how brazenly genocidal the American and Israeli governments were, and how there was very little pushback from that from mainstream political players. Really shocked me in a big way. But when I go back and look at history, especially this moment you're describing that your grandparents experienced after 9/11, an obvious form of fascism was already taking place in the early 2000s under the Bush administration.
Right.
But we like to think that fascism didn't arrive until Trump got elected. And so there's this kind of disconnect. I don't know. That's just kind of what's on
Yeah.
my mind with that.
It makes a lot of sense to me. Like once you become aware of a phenomena, then you can look back and see how long that phenomena has been around and how it came to be. Whereas before you're embedded in it, thus you can't see it. This to me relates very directly to the aims of Buddhist awakening, and maybe even more broadly like psychological development. Um, One of my early mentors was a philosopher named Ken Wilber, who has developed something called integral philosophy. And he cites a famous developmental psychologist, adult developmental psychologist, someone who's studying adult human development at Harvard named Robert Keegan. Robert Keegan has this great phrase where he says, the subject of one stage, that is, subject means I, the sense of self, the subject of one stage becomes the object of the subject of the next stage. So he's describing the way development works in a fundamental way. It's like you become aware of the sense of self and make it an object in your awareness. And then you push back into some new subjectivity, some new sense of self that is broader than the previous self, because this new self includes an awareness of the past one. So that's why it's developmental, not just merely I'm shifting over to a different perspective. You actually are bigger, you include more. And I think, what often happens, say, in a Buddhist awakening context is we limit the frame of awakening to like just your subjectivity, your sensory experience. And we say, just make all that an object. But don't look at the power structures and the systems that you're embedded in and that these institutions are embedded in, because that would sort of shake up our whole business model here and would probably, create some problems, or probably the people that I won't be so cynical. I'll say the leaders of these institutions, they just don't see this themselves, or they don't feel competent enough to kind of guide that kind of broader inquiry. But I see them as very related. It's like if you can include all of these different perspectives in your, in your awareness and make objects of these different things, you become free of them. And thus you have more range of motion in respect to how you relate to things, which is to me the point of awakening.
Yeah, well said. Arthur, I'm just curious what's on your mind right now.
Yeah, there's a lot. I love the linguistic talk. I read a lot of philosophy, and I'm a big Wittgenstein fan. And, he talks about language and language games and how it is. I think how you kind of described it really well, like in the Overton window of like what is capable of being discussed and things. So I really love that context. My understanding of Buddhism in terms of philosophy, what I've always been curious about is, we have these thinkers like Nietzsche, maybe, who talks about Buddhism, I know, as being, I grew up Catholic, and, so he talks about it being better than, maybe not, I don't know if he uses the term better than, but Catholicism and Christianity kind of get reduced into this like moral suffering problem. And he says, Buddhism goes beyond this. And so that it's great for that. And maybe he's like critical of traditions that try to quiet desire, or like maybe there's like this beauty in suffering that you can kind of, it allows for outlets of creativity and things like that. And so I'm curious about like how modern Buddhism kind of, does it embrace that? Does it reduce the suffering? How does that like tension exist currently? And I guess, my understanding of it is so narrow, maybe.
Yeah, this is a great question. And I think you're right. Like when people generally think of Buddhism and probably what Nietzsche had available to him in terms of Buddhist literature at the time, which is probably really
There's
limited.
a bias. Yeah.
Yeah, it was limited work he probably could pull from, and the translations are probably, questionable best. That said, I mean, when people think about Buddhism, I think they often do think about what I consider to be the early Buddhist tradition, which is very much of a kind of cosmological dualism philosophically, where you have what they call samsara, which is the endless cycle of suffering and rebirth, and then you have nirvana, which is this transcendent realization that sort of is unborn or beyond space and time. And the idea is in early Buddhism is you want to escape samsara and you want to get to nirvana. And the real ideal is to just kind of extinguish yourself entirely in this unborn condition, or the unconditioned, as the Buddha called it. A teacher that I mentioned earlier, Kenneth Folk, he jokingly called this the Cosmic Suicide Club. And there's some real truth to that. That is, in fact, the philosophical orientation of early Buddhism. And it's problematic in a lot of ways. But what people don't realize is that Buddhism itself has been wrestling with the problems of early Buddhism for now, since 200 CE, at least. And during that time, which is several hundred years after the historical Buddha was alive, there was like a whole nother wave of philosophical, you could say like a revolution in Buddhism. They called it the Mahayana revolution, which Mahayana just means the greater vehicle. And so they were referring to the early stuff as like the weaker vehicle, the lesser vehicle. They're just more or less putting themselves above. And I think they were right in a certain way. They actually did realize something profound, which was typified most clearly by this philosopher named Nagarjuna, where he said, Nirvana is samsara and samsara is nirvana. They're actually not two different things. And so this is the introduction of the idea of Buddhist non-duality, where that cosmological dualism collapses. And suddenly the Buddhist tradition starts looking different. It's not as much puritanical. It's not as transcendent focused. There's more of a turn back toward the human condition and the earthly condition. In Zen, which is a Mahayana tradition, you see this in the emphasis in nature and the awakening in nature, the way that in Zen monasteries, sweeping and cooking is as important as sitting in meditation. And then in later traditions, like in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, they have a whole tradition of what they call Mahasiddhas. They're these people, these great yogis, who actually were not monastics. They were embedded in completely normal life in northern India in like, say, 700 CE, 800 CE. And they were considered to be, kind of the pinnacle of realization in that tradition. These just ordinary people who had these extraordinary insights. And so the way that I look at modern Buddhism is that in a way it includes the history of all these things, and people are sort of trying to relate to and figure out what to emphasize and what to pick. You have more early Buddhist style, like it's a Buddhist fundamentalist groups that are trying to kind of still do the early Buddhist thing, and then you have others that are trying to remix a bunch of different things. That's kind of more what we do in our community. And so you've got this whole history really of kind of Buddhist evolution that's all available to us now. And you see all kinds of ways that people are trying to relate to that, including just taking bits of it and secularizing it and turning it into something like mindfulness, which is yet another way that people relate to these traditions.
Wow, that's really interesting. I think that's really great history on that. And yeah, when you get these canonized philosophers who have limited knowledge and they make a claim about something and then it gets canonized even further, it's so dangerous. So that's really great. I love that. Thanks.
Yeah, it's cool that to me it's really cool to note that Buddhism has an understanding of its own evolution as part of the tradition.
Yes, totally. Yeah, that makes
not every tradition does do that.
I was also thinking like, 2006, obviously like pre-social media, in some context there, and it's evolved so much. And you've talked about social meditation being one of those evolutions, I guess, in Buddhism. But, I guess like now that propaganda in social media aims to fragment our lives, how does the mindfulness and meditation deal with this like fragmentation of social media? Like it's arguing for that space all the time. And can mindfulness and meditation in Buddhism keep up with that and kind of engage with that in like a meaningful way? Or is it really a difficult thing to wage war? I mean, not war, but is it really difficult to wage against this kind of technology that's so advanced and cumbersome?
Yeah, I think the strains of modern Buddhism that they are called academically Buddhist modernism, which are sort of typified by the attempt to take the aspects and elements of Buddhism that can benefit us, can benefit our mental health, can benefit our performance, can benefit whatever, like really taking that individualist frame and co-opting Buddhism is essentially what these strains do. While they give tools that help people kind of train their own minds, they're limited to the focus on the individual experience, and thus they can't address relational or systemic factors. So people, I think, in a way, can even become even more captured if they think, oh yeah, I have a good relationship to my phone, and I don't, this stuff doesn't impact me because I'm, a meditator or whatever, which I would never claim, by the way. I had to give up my iPhone entirely because it was just way too stimulating. But like, I think they set themselves up in a way to become even easier to capture because they think they've got it figured out, and really, they're in the same boat, as the rest of us.
That makes sense. That's really cool. I like the giving up the iPhone. That's admirable.
Yeah. What I found in that process was like, I couldn't just go to the dumb phone or the light phone. Like those things were too extreme because 99% of people are on smartphones. So I went to an e-ink screen, and it turns out for me, like 80% of the draw into these, what I would call digital LSD, like devices, is the visuals and how easy they are to manipulate the operating system. So I got a crappy, Chinese color e-ink phone that runs off of Android, and I spend less than an hour a day on it now, whereas on my iPhone I was on it 6+ hours a day. Yeah. So that's helped, but it doesn't solve the larger issues you're talking about with, it's still just like, it helps me operate a little bit more sanely.
Definitely. But I think that's great. You're taking a point where it's like, we're all inculcated to think like iPhones are the base technology we all have, and people are giving them to their 8-year-olds and below.
Yeah.
And so I think to make the act and to take that, it's really great. We all ought to be away from these screens. There's way too much screen time. So that's cool.
Something that is on my mind a little bit, because I want to hit on it before we move to talking about maybe more practice-oriented stuff, like things we can do as individuals or communities to cultivate some of these insights or awakening experiences that are helpful for us and others. Just on the topic of propaganda and genocide and the Dharma community's reckoning with Gaza.
Or
I was looking through some of
in
you,
this case.
or non-reckoning, exactly.
Yeah.
I was looking through some of your podcast episodes and Substack articles, and also saw an article that your partner Emily wrote about Gaza. I think it's called "The Ground We Stand On," the piece that Emily wrote. And she used a phrase near the end of that article that I want to ask you about. What would a lion's roar for Gaza look like from the Western Dharma community? Lion's roar. Maybe you can unpack what that phrase lion's roar means in the context of the Dharma community, and then Emily invoking it, like what would it look like to have a lion's roar for Gaza?
The term lion's roar in the Buddhist context it's a way of describing the original Buddha's teachings on awakening. And when the Buddha taught on awakening, it was said that he taught with this lion's roar, meaning like it was so clear and it cut through so much misunderstanding at the time, thinking back to early Indic spirituality that he arose out of, which was primarily focused on, if you kind of look at the history, there was primarily focused on the sort of eternalistic idea of Atman. The Brahmanism was focused on trying to kind of become one with the eternal. The Buddha really cut through that, as well as cutting away from the caste system in India at the time. To be a contemplative, to become a homeless wandering monk, you actually left the caste system. It was not a different caste. It was literally the abandonment of the caste system. So, in that sense, the Buddha was extremely political, although, it's, if you don't know the history, it's hard to understand why that was so significant. So the lion's roar of the Buddha was really this teaching that went against the grain of the entire culture that he was in. It was almost like a 180-degree turn away from the caste-based Brahmanical tradition of India. And so, the question of how we could do that today with respect to Gaza, just kind of drawing that parallel of how could you, cut through the noise and cut through the kind of almost the completely wrong-headed metaphysics that has given rise to the kind of environment that we operate in, which I would say is neoliberal Buddhism, essentially. And I think it's a really interesting question.
Yeah, neoliberal Buddhism is something that strikes me as significant, that combining those, because that's kind of been my experience in terms of frustrations with the Dharma community. Like, I've learned a lot from so many different teachers, so many different books I've read and things, but I've always kind of politically been frustrated with many of the different teachers and everything. And even I've went through, you've interviewed Fleet Mall earlier
Yeah,
in your podcast.
he was one of my early teachers at Naropa. Right after
Oh,
he
okay.
came out of, it was the year after he left 17-year term of maximum security prison.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. So I went through his teacher training program.
Oh,
He
nice.
has an organization called the Engaged Mindfulness Institute, and they train Dharma they have a 1-year Dharma teacher training program. They call it mindfulness teacher training. In that program, we're in a cohort. It kind of feels like a group of students learning together. And when I was going through that program, I started the program like a month or two before October 2023. So as soon as the genocide in Gaza started, I was in the beginning of that program and sort of doing discussion boards with people. And this question always sort of arose in our discussion boards about what we do with the social world as teachers. What is our responsibility to it? How do we relate to it? And I always felt this kind of frustration from teachers and leaders in the community. I remember even on one retreat, one of my cohort members had asked Fleet during a discussion, what we're talking about loving kindness and meta practice and these sort of heart-based meditations. What do we do about the children in Gaza? She sort of asked him pointedly, what do we do about the children in Gaza? And he kind of stopped for a moment and reflected and acknowledged the suffering that she was pointing to. And then immediately kind of equivocated and said, yeah, a lot of kids are suffering in Gaza and a lot of kids are suffering in Israel too. And that
Right.
immediate kind of equivocation that he made, and
Right.
then an attempt to just kind of move on after that.
Both
I don't
sidism. Yeah.
know. I was struggling with so much rage in that moment. I wanted to throw my cushion at his head and scream at him.
I
And
wish you
I just
had.
felt, I was, it's, I don't know. It makes me feel so politically alone in the Dharma, in the Buddhist world, kind of. Sometimes it just
Yeah.
feels like there's a neoliberal status quo
Yes.
politically. And
Yes.
even among my cohort, when we were sort of discussing, what we do with society as teachers, a lot of my cohort members agreed with me with the problems I was pointing out with genocide, with colonialism, with capitalism. But there was also just a kind of shrug, a kind of like, I
Like,
mean,
what
I
can I
don't
do?
know. Yeah, like there's that, I don't know. What do we do with that? And I feel like you're
Mm.
already answering some of these questions with the work you're doing. So maybe if you want to talk about the pragmatic Dharma community or some of these other departures that you're making from the mainstream Western Buddhist
Yeah.
world and
Yeah.
how you're orienting toward things like uh, social liberation in your teaching work.
This is a big topic here, so we'll have to unpack it slowly. Well, first off, I'll just say I am sad to hear that. That was his response. I know Fleet, and I know from his background that he trained with Bernie Glassman, who was an early American Zen teacher, most, I think, known in some ways for the pioneering work he did to support and lift up people in Yonkers, New York, through creating these sort of Buddhist, I forget the name of his organization, but they created this sort of beautiful bakery system where people who were coming out of prison and people who were like definitely significantly less well-to-do were like able to build their lives here working in this institution. He also led what are called bearing witness retreats, including retreats at Auschwitz, where meditators would come and do a week-long retreat in like the death camps of Auschwitz. So this is a lineage. This is actually one of the Buddhist lineages that's more socially engaged. So to hear that someone from that space, even they're doing this, it's really disheartening to me. That said, I think the real challenge that I have with this topic is that, I mentioned my early mentor, Ken Wilber, and I mentioned development. I take often a developmental lens and I look at things that way because I think it helps explain a lot of phenomena that's hard to explain otherwise. One being, why is it that you can sit there and talk to someone about systems of oppression and marginalization and power dynamics, etc., and some people can just look at you, even if they're somewhat educated and just have, it can go right over their heads. Like they literally don't seem to be able to see what you're talking about. Well, I think it's because some people don't have the capability or haven't developed the capability yet to be able to do that, which seems obvious if you look back at your own history, right? Like we talked about, it's like, well, at what point did I become aware of these things? Well, it wasn't before I was 19 that I even saw the gap between like sort of like, the national story about ourselves and the actual experience of being an American and how much of a real difference there was. So a lot of people, they've never even had to go through that kind of reckoning. They've just lived inside of a bubble and never sort of had to they have been stressed enough to really think deeper. And for that reason, I think it's a real challenge because on the one hand, I want people to wake up to these things and take them seriously and start acting as if they matter, because they do. But on the other hand, I want to also meet people where they are and try to see if I can help them where they are so that in a way I could sort of help catalyze their maturation and development. And you mentioned the pragmatic Dharma community. This is a community where we're focused primarily on a kind of Buddhist, individualist focus. Like we're focusing primarily on our own individual practice and awakening, etc. You might have noticed there's not a whole lot of social stuff that we're talking about in that space. That's been a problem for me because while I think that's important and I do want to meet people there who are interested in awakening and interested in like mastering contemplative practices and want to do that in community, I think that's all fine and good. I do think there's a bridge to then being able to see some of these things that we're talking about here, of like the relational and the systemic as well. And for that reason, Emily and I we've started a new project called the Insight Diaspora. The Insight refers to the Insight meditation tradition, which is what we were both trained in. And for us, this is in a more explicit space to do this kind of practice and to kind of invite people that we think are already familiar with the critique. They already see the problems and they want to move away from that. And so I guess the way that I'm approaching this is almost in like an ecosystems approach of like having different things that can meet different people where they are and hoping to create connective tissue between them. And for me, the connective tissue is social meditation is the most clear, obvious connector. Because I think there's a huge gap between talking about me, my experience, which is like, you could say that's a first person perspective, I, and then talking about the world and the systems and politics and propaganda, all of which is, we're taking a third person perspective when we talk about that. It's that we're standing outside of it, talking about it. For me, it's like the thing that connects those two is relationship. It's the second person. It's the ability to move from I to it is for we to figure out what it is. And these modern Buddhisms that I've talked about, they don't have those technologies in them. They don't have the ability to kind of break meditation outside of the self, the egg of the self, and to extend it beyond to include others. And then once you do that, it's natural to then want to include the world, I think, and to understand the dynamics of the world, the environment, human-created systems, all of that, which end up shaping our relationships and our subjectivity much more than we probably want to admit. Like that's the critique of capitalism and critique of all these things. It's like, yeah, these things are constantly shaping our interiority, and they're constraining what we can even experience as ourselves and what we can express, what we can own. Like it took me a very long time to acknowledge and admit publicly that I was Palestinian because I was scared to death of doing that. I was like, I see how my brown skinned Palestinian family are being treated. Like, I don't want to be treated like that. So yeah, these things are, I think, really important. So yeah, that's kind of how I'm trying to approach it right now. I'm not saying it works because we're at the early stages of building these kind of ecosystem, but that is kind of my current attempt to do that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And like for me, it's discovering your community and the work you're doing there has been really, it's been a huge relief because kind of so far in my own development intellectually with just studying, but also practicing meditation and working through those different areas of development, I've felt kind of there have been two big camps, two big convictions that I've been drawn towards. One is the individual practice, sort of rooted in early Buddhist approaches to meditation, and that whole, like you mentioned earlier, the cosmological duality that's sort of present there. The goal is to liberate yourself so that you can escape the world of suffering
Yes.
completely.
Good for
and then on
you.
the other hand, yeah, on the other hand, I've been drawn to Marxism, to socialism, to things that are radically interested in upending the capitalist order of the world. And so there's this individual liberation that I've been drawn to, and then there's this radical social liberation that I've been drawn to. And it's felt like such a hard line between them. But some of the work that you're doing is starting to, like you said, develop some connective tissue between those two approaches. I've seen
Yeah.
Obviously, I've been frustrated by Dharma teachers who aren't willing to engage with real social liberation in a meaningful way.
Mhm.
On the other hand, I've seen like communists online just openly say that individual liberation and social liberation are mutually exclusive. You have to do
Right.
one or the other. There's no doing them at the same time. And I
That's
just
another
reject
extreme,
that.
right?
Yeah, I reject
Yeah.
that completely. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, it's just
Yeah.
nice to hear that you're starting to I don't know, chart the path between those two extremes in a meaningful way.
Yeah. That's the intention for sure. Yeah, and I'm so with you there. I think another connective tissue here, maybe as you're talking, occurs to me is like the what the Buddhist tradition has to offer by way of what they call generosity, or the early term for that is they call it dana. And I was reading a neo-Marxist philosopher, Kojin Karatani's work, The Structures of World History, several years ago. And this was as I spent 6 years as a post-capitalist monk, in that I earned 100% of my income from generosity-based sources. I wasn't doing any pay-for-service. So I really tried to, embody this. Although my wife Emily had a contract and was making money from pay-for-service things. So I got to be the holy one among the two of us. It ended up being a problem. But I remember reading Kojin's work, and he kind of makes this shift from classical Marxism, where he says, instead of focusing on the modes of production, let's talk about modes of exchange. Let's talk about these ways that humans have exchanged things for time immemorial. And he has four modes of exchange that he identifies. One is the commerce mode. And so he sort of acknowledges like commerce has been a thing for like as long as humans have been doing things. That's been one mode that we engage in. He also talked about like another mode that's more like it's kind of like you see in the feudalistic modes, like protect and serve. It's like you kind of give over some of your autonomy and agency in exchange for being protected. This is like how the modern nation state works in a way. It has a monopoly of violence. And in a way, like you're trading some freedoms for like relative safety, etc. And then there's the conditional generosity mode that he talks about, which is what you see in most families. It's like or friendships, or you're like I scratch your back, you scratch mine. Like we do things for each other, but we expect it to be taken care of in return. And he said, there's a fourth mode. He called it mode D, and this is like unconditional generosity. And he said the only place you see this actually operationalized in history is in early Buddhist and Christian monastic communities that actually like lived this way. And that is unconditional generosity. There's no strings attached. You give because you think there's something good here, and then that's it. And I think there's something really profound about that kind of mode, because it arises out of a certain experience of openness and of a dissolution of self-others. It's only possible to give that way unconditionally when you are in touch with something unconditioned in experience, like an unconditioned friendliness or care. And that's probably why it's also so rare. But I think, Buddhism does have something profound, this profound kind of history of trying to do something in this vein of unconditional generosity that like we so desperately seem to need right now, and are so obviously missing with the privatization of everything, which seems to be the neoliberal condition.
Hey everyone, we are going to cut it there for this episode. So tune back in Thursday to catch the second portion of this. If you like the show and want to support us, give us a like or a review, or share the show with your friends and family. That's the best way to make sure that it continues to grow. And as always, stay safe, stay aware, and remember that propaganda loves you.